I think about a year ago we were talking. I think we were confronted with the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and al-Sharaa taking over, sweeping through Syria. It was we talked then about the instability in the system, what that kind of transformation would mean for the Middle East and prospects elsewhere. A year on, I think this conference is really bookended by two things. On the one hand, we've got a US armada, off Iran, actually threatening to do in Iran what it's already done in Venezuela, perhaps even more dramatically, given that it's already bombed in collaboration with Israel. It's already bombed Iran. But on the other hand, I think it's been absolutely tremendous to see the resistance to ICE in Minneapolis, in New York, Chicago, and so many other places, and so I think the conference and discussion really bookended by that. The threat, if you like, of what Trump actually means and the crisis that it's encapsulated, world imperialism and the resistance we see in the US as well. And of course, it's plenty of time we'll actually be discussing more about the Palestine movement, what the Palestine movement actually represents. But here I'm going to deal a little bit more with the question of imperialism. I mean, we've always talked about why imperialism it's a combination of economic and military competition, but there are times when that competition is much more military and much less economic, but they're always interlinked. But I think right now we're seeing a way in which the shifts in world imperialism are really exposing the extent to which that naked competition and what Trump actually represents in that regard. Kind of the decline of the US's position in world imperialism, the question of trying to use the military force, in which the US is still preeminent. It's got 30% of the world's military spending is the US. It spends more than the other 9 countries, including Russia and China, than the other 9 subsequent countries. So its military power is immense, and it's actually trying, not for the first time, of course, I'm sure that will come up in discussion, using that military power, its preeminent military power, to make up for, to compensate for, its declining economic power. And also in the hope, that use of that military power actually forces economic concessions, from other sections of the world. I mean, the other thing which I think is that we're looking at the shift in imperialism much more, the gunboat diplomacy, if you like, which is much more characteristic of 19th century and early 20th century imperialism, has become a feature of the 21st century imperialism. And in spite of the shifts in the way in which world imperialism has conducted itself, we really are back to a situation much more like the beginning of the 20th century. It is much more exposed that there is general competition between the major powers major powers in the world, and that end of the rules-based order, which has been a long time coming, is now obviously much more apparent. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, kind of put it very succinctly at Davos, but where he said that the old rules-based order is gone, and more importantly, in some respect, is that the old rules-based order is not coming back. And in the aftermath of a lot of the exchange between Canada and the US over tariffs, since then, Mark Carney's been to China. Trump went from fine, should be some kind of deal. Canada gets some kind of deal, that's going to be fine, to Trump threatening to put 100% tariffs on Canada in the aftermath of his deal with China. Keir Starmer has now been to China as well, to try and extract some of the economic concessions. So in that respect, you see a situation where, even though I think the big picture is still the question of US and China, and I'll come back to that in a tick, but in that process, what the US in trying to carve out and entrench and increase its economic position, that has exposed the degree in which the old rules-based order, the extent to which NATO was a cosy club of the EU and the US in Europe. That's not really the case anymore. The US is quite willing to use both its economic and military clout to try to force the European powers into taking, play their share, make a bigger show in terms of the EU. And I think, Carney's comments there come in the aftermath of all the things about, Trump attempting to take Greenland, saying he was prepared to use military power, to take Greenland. The fact that just some European powers moved troops into Greenland to forestall that. We saw Trump back down over that particular question, but he certainly hasn't backed down as far as using the gun vote diplomacy, is concerned. But there is a method in the madness, I think, when you look at what Trump is actually doing. I don't think it's a retreat in one respect to the Western Hemisphere in trying to shore up the economic position of the US, but nonetheless, I think that's what it is. The whole his initial attempt to try and batter down the various constraints, economic constraints with tariffs, by and large didn't really go anywhere. The prospect of actually trying to get a greater degree of manufacturing in the US, to force big multinationals to reinvest in the US to substantially boost manufacturing, that hasn't gone anywhere. It's gone a little bit, but it's far too slow to establish the US power in once again. So I think that we've seen that in that respect now the strategy which Trump has adopted is much more about how does Trump actually shore up its economic control in South America and elsewhere to actually bolster its position ultimately to get to maintain that increase its position, support its position against China. So Trump is going to go and China is going to shake Xi Jinping's hand in April, but the reality is I think that's all for show as Trump actually prepares the world for prepares the US and the world for a greater showdown. And I think in that regard, you look at South America. I mean, we've been over this. There's been quite a few discussions in the branches. China is South America's biggest trading partner. If you want to know why, why Trump when he captured Maduro, I think it's not just a question of Venezuela. It's also a question of what South America actually represented in the way in which taking that action in Venezuela could support US's position as far as South America is concerned. 22 of the South American countries have deals with Belt and Road, have deals with China, and we've seen very quickly that Trump has used that the control such as it is, and I'm not going into that in any detail, but the control such as it is over the Venezuelan oil to try now to pressure Cuba, and actually there's a reason I think there's a connection between what he's done in Venezuela and and Iran and China, because the question of the control of oil that comes out of the Middle East, in particular control over Iran also is a major exporter, or China is a major importer of oil from Iran. So there's method in the madness of Trump's gun vote diplomacy, which is underpinned by what is I think one of the important parts of what Lenin argued in the run-up to the First World War, the arguments about imperialism, the arguments about that war is intrinsic to capitalism. It inevitably comes out of the competition between its nation states and the Middle East itself. And when you look at the Middle East, that you can also see the logic I mentioned Iran. But if you look at the question between the Middle East and China, the US is dabbling in the Middle East again is not just the question of entrenching its power there. I mean, it is entrenching its power there, but it's also concerned the Saudi Arabia and Iran stitched up a deal in China. China was able to, there's a question mark about how effective that was, but nonetheless, Saudi Arabia and Iran went to China to come to some kind of bigger agreement. So Trump's capacity to discipline Saudi Arabia is also a question of disciplining China, or at least pulling and ensuring that the Middle East is pulled much more under US control. And I think again you can see that the way in which the US's support of Israel in terms of Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iran is, similarly, it's not something which is separate from US imperialism. It's actually a way in which it's actually a way in which the US has used the struggle in Palestine has used Israel's genocide in Gaza to extend its influence as well. All right, I just need to hurry up over the next little bit. I'm not going to have time really to go through the fundamental changes in imperialism, but I think it's important. I can flag that a little bit. I think it's important to recognise that change. At the end of the Cold War, which had been effectively two essential military blocs in the world, and that's the way in which was the umbrella in which the competition between world powers was constrained. With the end of the Cold War, the US emerges as the preeminent military power, but even at that time it was still somewhat constrained and willing to work with NATO, with the EU, to try and maintain whether it's the IMF, the general institutions of world capitalism as a way in which it was going to exercise it, and continue to exercise its power. What we saw, and going to go into detail, but when it intervened in Iraq in 1991, again, it was an indication of, with the end of the Cold War, of its willingness to use its military power to try and dictate terms in Iraq, as I said before, to use its military power to try and entrench its economic position. I think now what happened subsequently, though, is that the US lost in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And so even though its use of military power, when it lost in Iraq, and it lost in Iraq and Afghanistan, but unlike previously, where those kinds of defeats have actually meant that there's been some kind of military retreat, some kind of concern about the way in which the US is going to use its military power, the arguments that were made by the neocons, as they were called, the people that projected the new American century in the 2000s, actually fitted much more with the circumstances which the US finds itself as well. So so I think we're going to see. I'm just trying to get across. I think we've got a far more unstable, far more uncertain world as the US now resorts much more to using its military power to try and shore up its economic situation, and we can expect, I think, that the instability that we've seen over the past little period really is the new normal. What I just wanted to finish with is why the importance of actually understanding and having a general understanding and analysis of imperialism. When you think of the arguments that we've had to make in the campaigns over the last year, the issue about the right of the Palestinians to resist. So that really comes out of an understanding of imperialism and an understanding of what the struggle of oppressed countries against imperialist powers, why revolutionaries stand on the side of that struggle unconditionally. Again, the unconditional but critical has been that argument has been crucial to positioning ourselves inside not just a question of Palestine, where it's the question of what side we take as far as the imperialist struggle is concerned, why we're on the side of the Palestinians, but it also is why we're critical of the Arab powers, why we're critical of Hamas, why in spite of the military strategies we're critical of the military strategies in spite of supporting that struggle against the US. But it's also been important in understanding Venezuela, how to position ourselves in Venezuela. It's important, about Iran. The other element which I think has happened out of the shift in imperialism is the emergence of the sub-imperialist powers and the greater degree of instability that has arisen with that. Saudi Arabia has now got to deal with Pakistan to get nuclear power. The collapse of Bashir al-Assad saw the rise of al-Sharaa across Syria, but we've now seen what that's actually meant in the north of Syria as the SDF and the Kurds. The US has pulled its support from the Kurds in the north, and al-Sharaa is sweeping across that. So I think over and over again we're going to see the importance of that that theoretical understanding. So I think there is that we often talk about the centre cannot hold. and it comes from a William Yeats poem in 1919, I think, and it came in very, very similar circumstances. That it looked like the institutions of world capitalism were incapable of actually dealing with the crisis in capitalism, with the road coming out of the First World War to the Second War, to the pressure of the Second World War, and I think that's what we have to take on board now. I think if the centre can't hold, then what we're seeing that instability in a far more general way, and that's what really underpins the arguments. I think the arguments that we've had to make and the arguments that are going to come over the next bit. There's another session we'll talk much more about globalised the Intifada, but I think there's a reason they don't like globalised the Intifada. There's a reason that they've raised that, and the New South Wales government is now talking about trying to ban that. But we have to infuse globalised that Intifada with understanding. It's been raised in the Palestine movement that it needs to be fused with a genuine anti-imperialist politics that allows to raise the question about it's not just a question of US imperialism, it's a question of the imperialist system, the capitalist system itself. That's what has to be taken on. We need to build a revolutionary alternative for the struggles here and for the smash the global system, which is keeping the world at risk of war and entrenching the poverty and misery that it's based on.